Welcome to the deep dive. Sometimes the most intriguing stories are really about the debates happening behind closed doors.
Exactly.
And that really feels like what we're looking at today with Arsenal. Their reported search for a new striker this summer.
Yeah, it seems these sources we've been digging into, they suggest there's a pretty significant internal discussion, maybe even a disagreement, about who should be the main target.
Right, a real dilemma.
Absolutely, and that's what these sources are unpacking. We've pulled together quite a bit of material that specifically compares two players apparently right at the top of Arsenal's list. Viktor Gyokeres from Sporting CP.
Okay.
And Benjamin Sesko, currently at RB Leipzig.
So our mission for this deep dive is, well, to cut through these different sources, compare these two guys across the key areas the reports highlight. We want to understand that reported conflict, see who the sources, based on their analysis, think is the better fit, especially when you consider both are apparently carrying that hefty 70 million price tag.
And the core tension here, as presented in these sources, is quite fascinating, really. They report that the sporting director, Andrea Berta, he's said to be pushing for Gyokeres.
Okay.
Which seems to, clash a bit with earlier groundwork that suggested Sesko was actually the initial #1 target. There was even talk, reportedly, of a gentleman's agreement with Leipzig about that price.
So it sets up that classic kind of sure bet now versus maybe the higher potential guy.
That's precisely the scenario these sources paint, a real strategic choice.
Okay, let's get into it then. Let's unpack the comparison points the sources lay out, starting with, the obvious one for a striker, scoring goals.
Yeah, the absolute #1 job.
And the sources really hammer home that finding consistent goals has been maybe a bit of an issue for Arsenal. They present this area as one where one of these players really shines.
They definitely zero in on Viktor Gyokeres here. Now, he had good numbers at Coventry, respective goal contributions.
I remember that, yeah.
But the analysis in these sources says he just, exploded after moving to Lisbon.
Exploded how?
The figures they cite are, frankly, remarkable. A combined 123 goal contributions. That's 95 goals and 28 assists in just 100 games.
Wow. In 100 games, that's huge.
It really is. And the sources put this down to his lethal finishing, powerful ball carrying, and just electric pace.
Okay, those are some serious numbers. How does Sesko stack up in the source's view on, putting a ball in the net?
Well, the material notes, Sesko also has that similar kind of cannon of a right foot, apparently good with both, actually, and that same sort of blistering speed.
Right.
But his actual figures, according to these reports, they just haven't reached Gyokeres level yet. We're talking 27 goal contributions from 44 matches last season.
Okay, so a decent return, but not quite Gyokeres level.
Exactly. And a key point the sources make is that Sesko, he tends to miss chances sometimes. They suggest he still has, significant work to do to become that truly elite, top-tier European goal scorer. Not like Gyokeres, who they seem to frame as being there already.
Though to be fair, the sources do mention Sesko's playing in the Bundesliga, right? A tougher league.
They do concede that, yes.
Yeah.
And they absolutely acknowledge he has a very high ceiling, lots of potential for improvement.
But based purely on current output and finishing consistency as laid out in the sources.
Based on that, their verdict on this first point is pretty clear. Viktor Gyokeres.
All right, let's shift gears then. From scoring to aerial threat. Now, we know Mikel Arteta puts a lot of stock in this.
Hugely important.
Not just for heading goals, but as a crucial outlet for the team, especially when playing out from the back or against a high press.
And this is an area where the sources really highlight Benjamin Sesko's profile. He's tall, stands at an imposing 6'4".
That's big.
Yeah, and the analysis says he uses that height really effectively. He's averaging 2.56 aerial wins per 90 minutes.
Is that good?
The sources frame that as a high number for a striker, yeah. And they point to this focal point nature he offers as a major plus for Arteta. Fills a need for that kind of aerial presence up front, something they've perhaps lacked a bit since Kai Havertz got injured.
Okay, so Sesko ticks that box. What about Gyokeres? He's a big lad too, physically imposing.
He is, but the sources are quite blunt on this one. They state that despite his physique, Gyokeres is, and I quote roughly here, much weaker in the air.
Really? Much weaker?
Yeah, and they back it up with data. They note he ranks only in the 18th percentile for aerials won across what they call the men's next 14 competitions.
So outside the top 5 leagues.
Exactly, they make that specific point. So basically, out of 100 comparable players, he's only stronger in the air than about 17 of them. That suggests, a pretty significant limitation in that specific area. And the material adds, he hardly ever scores with his head. None of his 52 goals in the 24-25 season apparently came from headers. 0.
And that feels quite significant if, as the sources suggest, Arteta is after these, marginal gains and wants players who can contribute across the board.
Precisely. The sources imply Sesko's aerial ability is something he can work on, develop further. Whereas for Gyokeres, based on this analysis, it looks like an area where he maybe simply cannot do it at the level Arsenal might need for that tactical option.
So a clear verdict there from the sources.
Yep. On aerial threat, the source's verdict is firmly Benjamin Sesko.
Okay, next up, link-up play. At Arsenal, the number 9 under Arteta, it's not just about being a finisher, is it?
No, definitely not.
It involves dropping deeper, holding the ball up under pressure, bringing the wingers and midfielders into the game, a lot of combination play.
And the sources suggest this is another area where Gyokeres doesn't perhaps naturally fit the bill perfectly. They acknowledge his speed, his agility, but they state he's not particularly great at receiving with his back to goal or consistently linking play in that way. The material points out his success at Sporting comes partly because they play such a transition-heavy style.
Right, so he thrives running onto things, maybe.
More running into space, yeah. Which raises the question for the sources. Can he reliably do that intricate link-up stuff against, say, a packed Premier League defense under different tactics?
Makes sense. And Sesko, how do they frame his link-up game?
Well, Sesko also plays for a team, Leipzig, that's very good in transition, and he absolutely uses his pace to threaten space. No doubt about that.
Okay.
However, the sources really highlight that Sesko is comfortable dropping deep.
Yeah.
She shows real skill in tight spaces, apparently has quite elegant footwork for a big guy.
Oh, interesting.
And this, the sources suggest, could be really valuable against those Premier League teams that sit in a low block, defend deep and deny space in behind. You need a striker who can connect play outside the box then.
So while both are used to transitions, Sesko maybe has more of the raw tools for that tighter, deeper link-up role. Is that the idea?
That seems to be the implication from the sources, yeah.
Yeah.
They say Sesko, like other parts of his game, still needs to develop here. It's not perfect. But they see him as someone who can genuinely grow into that specific role effectively. Gyokeres, in contrast, the analysis suggests he might be closer to his finished article in his current style, thriving after the link-up or in transition, and might find it harder to, add that specific layer well.
So for link-up play, the sources lean towards Sesko again.
That's their verdict, yes. Benjamin Sesko.
Okay, let's talk about work off the ball, out of possession work. Arsenal's system, it demands a lot from the front players, pressing high, winning it back.
Absolutely crucial.
The sources actually say here that Arteta would be spoilt for choice with these two.
Yeah, both get pretty high marks here.
Yeah.
The sources do spend a bit of time highlighting Sesko, suggesting his impressive work rate helps compensate for his slightly lower goal tally compared to Gyokeres.
Right.
Pressing is just core to that Red Bull ethos, isn't it? That high-energy counter-pressing style Leipzig is known for.
It really is.
And the sources describe Sesko as committing completely. He presses aggressively, but also intelligently, cutting off passing lanes effectively. They praise his tremendous personal engine and his sharp eye for danger, which they think would really help Arsenal force turnovers high up the pitch.
Okay, sounds very positive for Sesko. What about Gyokeres' defensive work?
He also gets praise, definitely. The sources say Gyokeres works incredibly hard off the ball too. And it's key, right? It helps to create the turnovers that let him use his pace in transition.
Makes sense.
They note he seemed to have good judgment, knows when to press, when to hold his position. However, the sources do point to some data suggesting maybe he could be a little more effective in the outcome of his defensive actions.
How so?
They cite low success rates for things like blocks and clearances, ranking down in the 23rd and 30th percentiles, respectively. So maybe putting in the effort, but not always getting the tackle or block in.
Yeah. So both work hard, but maybe Sesko's pressing is a bit more refined? Perhaps due to his background.
That's possibly the nuance. The sources conclude that while Sesko's Leipzig upbringing might give him a slight theoretical edge in a really structured pressing system, this probably isn't going to be the deciding factor for Arteta. Scoring goals is the #1 priority, right?
Absolutely.
And both players offer more than enough effort and application off the ball. So on this point, the sources ultimately call them difficult to split.
Okay, so the verdict from the sources on out-of-possession work is basically a tie.
But that's right. They see plenty of positives in both, enough to consider them strong fits here.
Right, now for the final comparison point. And the sources frame this one as potentially a big threat to a deal for Sesko. Immediate impact.
Ah, yes, the now factor.
Exactly. They really emphasize Arsenal's pressing need, as they see it, to win major trophies now. They highlight, what they describe as 5.5 years without the league or European success, barring that FA Cup win, and several near misses recently.
And this is where the sources really build the case for Gyokeres. They state he's just entering his prime years as a striker.
Okay.
And crucially, he has proven experience playing, and not just playing, but thriving in English football from his Coventry days.
That championship experience.
Exactly. They argue that when you combine that English experience with his current, explosive goal-scoring form, well, he looks like the perfect candidate, ready to just step into Arsenal's attack and deliver straight away.
Makes a compelling case. And Sesko, obviously younger, less proven at that absolute elite level yet.
That's the contrast the sources draw. Sesko's very young, about to turn 22. He hasn't really had that single, undeniable breakout campaign yet where he's torn up a top league.
Right.
They point out that parts of his game, maybe one-on-one finishing, some aspects of his playmaking still need refining before you'd say he's truly considered world-class.
Which is fair for his age.
Totally fair. And they acknowledge he could absolutely explode into that level very quickly. They even mentioned Alexander Isak, perhaps, as an example of a player Arsenal reportedly looked at but didn't sign back in 2022, who then took off.
But the argument from the sources is that Arsenal's urgency kind of overrides that potential payoff.
Precisely. The sources argue quite forcefully that Arsenal simply cannot afford to wait for a player to fully develop when the pressure's on to win titles now. They state, Arsenal needs a sure bet up front. Someone who is ready to hit the ground running and solve that goal-scoring need immediately.
And based on that immediate need, that sure bet factor, the source's verdict on this final point lands firmly with Gyokeres.
Yes, that's their conclusion here. Despite Sesko's obvious talent and huge potential down the line, the current timing, given Arsenal's reported situation and ambitions, seems to favor Gyokeres as the more ready-made, immediate solution.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together then, based on what the sources are telling us. They compare the two across these 5 key traits. Gyokeres gets the strong nod for proven scoring and for immediate impact. Sesko is favored for his aerial threat and his potential in link-up play.
And they're pretty much tied on the off-the-ball work rate.
Right. So what's the source's final conclusion? Who do they think is the better overall fit, considering everything?
Well, their ultimate conclusion is that it's actually incredibly hard to split them cleanly. They reckon either player would likely come in and make a really significant positive impact for Arsenal.
Okay, so not a slam dunk either way then.
Not according to these sources, no. However, they do reiterate that Gyokeres holds what they see as a crucial advantage. He's perceived as being Premier League ready today.
Ah, that phrase again.
Yeah, and crucially, possessing that English football experience, which, as the material suggests, Mikel Arteta values very highly when looking at potential signings.
So despite Sesko having maybe a more rounded profile in some ways, or higher potential ceiling?
Exactly. Despite that compelling profile, the sources seem to believe Arsenal's reported need for that sure bet right now.
Someone guaranteed, or as close to guaranteed as you can get, to deliver goals immediately.
That need ultimately tilts the scales in the source's analysis towards Gyokeres as the player more likely positioned to meet the club's immediate requirements.
It really frames it as that classic trade-off, doesn't it? Proven, ready-made impact versus perhaps higher long-term potential and specific attributes that might take a bit more time to fully blossom.
That seems to be the absolute core of their argument, yeah. A tough choice.
Yeah.
That's how Arsenal's decision-makers see it too.
Okay, well that wraps up our deep dive into these sources comparing Viktor Gyokeres and Benjamin Sesko as potential Arsenal targets. We've seen the breakdown. Gyokeres presented as the sure bet, ready now, proven scorer, English experience. Sesko highlighted for maybe a higher ceiling, definite aerial strength, promising link-up play, but still needing development. Now, considering Arsenal's reported urgent desire for trophies now, and that internal disagreement the sources mentioned right at the start, what factor from this whole comparison do you think should ultimately swing the decision for the club? Something to think about.